It's Wednesday, May 12th, 2021, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues, Kathy Kiley and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, last week actually, it was the Los Angeles Times. This week, we're going to talk about the Washington Post and the woman that it has tapped as its newest executive editor.
And this is the 78th annual Hunger Games.
Golden Globes.
Golden Globes.
NBC announces it's sitting out the 2022 Golden Globes, a protest against the Hollywood Foreign Press Association's policies and procedures. And Facebook prepares to test a new pop-up designed to keep people who haven't read an article yet from sharing it. We'll explain. There's a lot more that I'm hoping we're going to be able to talk about before our half hour is up today, but we're going to start with word that the Trump Justice Department seized the telephone records of 3 Washington Post reporters. Kathy, fill us in on what happened and how it is that we're just now finding out and that the reporters are finding out that this was happening.
Well, the reporters found out because the Justice Department finally notified them, and this is the problem. This is not the first time this has happened. It's happened under previous administrations as well. And the problem is that the Justice Department can, or the prosecutors or the FBI can go to a telephone provider, an email provider, and ask for these records. And it is not until after the fact that the journalists find out what has happened. And of course, the problem here is it makes it very difficult to protect your sources. And if telephone providers or email providers can just hand these things over without any advance notice, there's no way for the reporters or the publications to fight back in court before this thing is turned over. It just makes it very difficult, I think, to do journalism. It has a chilling effect, certainly on our sources, because if we can't promise them protection, it's going to make them reluctant to talk.
Well, and the Department of Justice was saying that it was the sources that it was going after, not the journalists, that it was trying to investigate leaks coming out of the administration itself.
Right, and this has been an ongoing thing. I mean, Kathy's right. I mean, there's previous administrations, I think going all the way back to Clinton, have used this tactic. And it's one of those things where they just get obsessed with trying to find out who's leaking information. And it's really gotten to the point now where journalists are going back to the tried and true, I'm going to meet you somewhere and we're going to have a discussion, because we can't talk on the phone. And of course, we can't use email or anything like that because they have access to that as well. So now the only way you can provide confidentiality in these cases where it's likely that the Justice Department is going to go after these records is to meet face to face.
So one of the things that was interesting, and you mentioned this, Kathy, a little bit, is that this is something, you both have mentioned this, something that has been going on for decades. If we're talking about going back to the Clinton administration, the Obama administration actually set a record for doing this, going after 9 different leakers that they attempted to prosecute for doing this. There were a lot of people who would immediately want to point fingers and say that's the Trump administration. It was the Trump Department of Justice. But Joe Biden and his administration has actually come out since this came out. I believe it was maybe Thursday evening or Friday evening, the afternoon-ish, and has defended the practice.
Yeah, well, it doesn't matter what party a president is from, they all want to control the message. And every president wants to have that ability and is reluctant to give it up. They all give lip services to the power of the press and the importance of the free press when they speak at the White House Correspondents' Dinner or the Gridiron Club. But when the rubber hits the road and it's they've had a leak that they don't like, or they think they might have a leak that they don't like, they want to exercise this control. And really, when I remember this really starting with the going after phone records, was really after 9/11, when and this is what I think is so insidious about it, is that the federal government is using powers that are designed to combat terrorism in order to combat journalism. And even if you're going after the sources, what you're going after is the journalism, because we need our sources, and you can't do reporting without sources. So if you put a chilling effect on the sources, you've basically made it very difficult for us to tell people what's going on in the corridors of power.
I mean, really, it really goes back even further than that. I mean, you've had presidents going all the way back to John Adams, who has used the threat to national security as a reason to stifle any kind of information that's coming out from a presidential administration, and in some cases Congress as well. And then they use that as a pretense to stifle any kind of cooperation that someone may have with journalism, but then they turn right back around, as Kathy said, and say, well, we're for transparency and we're for freedom of the press and this sort of thing, until they see the stories that start coming out that they consider to be not in their best interest. And so they'll come out and say, well, these leaks are a threat to national security, therefore we must use these laws and these rules to be able to combat that.
Okay. Well, so as we're talking about this happening to the reporters at the Post, there's some also some other news coming out of that newsroom. Yesterday, it was announced that there is a new boss there. Sally Busby will take over next month, replacing Marty Barron, and she's joining a cadre of women and journalists of color who are being tapped to lead major newsrooms across the country. This one of the biggest, a newsroom of more than 1,000 people. And it's a name that you're familiar with. Some of our other colleagues also know very, very well.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is we've seen a whole new wave of, as you said, bosses and newsrooms who aren't white males. And that is unusual. Certainly for most of my career, the bosses have always been white males. And so this is a big deal. It's really a big deal, I think, at the Post. I think Sally Busby is a really interesting choice. Nobody can say she is East Coast elite. She's a Jayhawk. And, the other interesting thing about Sally is she spent her entire career at the Associated Press. And so if the New York Times is the Cadillac Escalade of our business and the Washington Post is maybe the slightly...
top-of-the-line Buick?
Yeah, or maybe the rehabbed Mercedes,
okay.
Right? Previously owned. Then the AP is the Jeep. The AP is our Jeep. The AP is the outfit that has gone out there, covered hard news, been in every state house. So she really knows news, the nuts and bolts of news from the ground up. And I think it's interesting that in appointing her, the Post talked about her international experience, but she started in the Midwest. And I think she's worked her way up. And I think that's going to give her a very different and interesting perspective on the news.
One of the other things about the AP that's especially interesting to me is that it's not a purely print culture, that she is coming from an environment where producing video, photographs are key to what the AP Wire is putting out there in addition to copy. Video, that idea that we are moving towards this cross-platform environment, that is the future, that is what we need to be producing, and that in selecting her, the Post is making that commitment to international reporting, but also that commitment to not just being a pile of dead trees.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the things that Jeff Bezos has sort of talked about ever since he purchased the Washington Post, is moving it in a direction to being a not just a newspaper, but a media organization that does all those things that you talked about. And so in bringing in someone who has grown up in an organization that is both digital as well as print as well as video, then she has this sort of background to be able to do that. The other thing that I find interesting about her hiring is that if you look at her record in the AP, she's brought in people of color and women behind her to support the things that she's wanted to do in AP's movement forward. And I think that had a lot to do with her being hired, but also going back to last week, we talked about Kevin Merida, same thing. brought in people of color, brought in women in roles where you're actually doing the work. And I think that has the potential to really make a difference in these newsrooms, because what's happened in the past is, yes, they would bring someone in, a person of color or maybe a woman, but the people behind them are still the white males who control the operation. Now you have an opportunity with Kevin and Busby to be able to see whether or not they're going to actually do at the LA Times and the Washington Post what they were doing at AP and at the Undefeated.
And what that does in so many ways is it creates both the opportunity for an internal culture change, which we've also talked about the Washington Post kind of needing a little bit when we're talking about like that memo that even went out early last week about statehood and where and how to express yourself. But as that internal culture change happens, the audience sees it in the differences and in the improvement in the news and the coverage and how that's delivered to them.
The coverage, and the distribution. Those are the three things that these news organizations, the Washington Post, LA Times, and we're going to see what's going to happen with the New York Times here pretty soon, whether or not that's going to happen with all of them. But those are the three key things that these news organizations have to do in order to be able to reach the communities that they claim they want to reach.
So let's say they're successful in doing that. What kind of a threat does that then pose to the television networks that have had a little bit more of the ease of reach, that perhaps there's a very different competitor to the news side at CNN or to the NBC News or ABC News platforms, and how they're attempting to reach too? Because they have the benefit, take CNN out of that equation, but NBC, ABC, CBS have the benefit of an over-the-air distribution that technically could be free and entirely ad-supported.
Well, I mean, part of the issue for the legacy three television networks you're talking about is they're fighting the streaming services right now. And the streaming services are the thing that's really sort of seen as something that they're going to have to navigate. And now you have this coming along, but then you also have people are using social media in ways that they aren't using television. And that is a threat as well. And that was the threat, or is the threat, to these news organizations like the Washington Post, New York Times, and LA Times. And they're going after it in that way. It's a total disruption that's going on that's impacting both the news side as well as the entertainment side.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that. Certainly the students we see every day aren't going to on-the-air TV. They're not going to on-the-air appointment TV. So I think, in some ways, the more successful organizations are having the hardest time, because you have to dismantle something that has been very successful in order to rebuild. And so I think that's why you're seeing sort of iterations. I mean, certainly the Post has been evolving, the New York Times has been evolving, the networks are evolving, but it sometimes takes several generations of leadership to get it there. And so I think you're seeing that evolution. And then I think the other thing on the issue of diversity, we're gone beyond tokenism now. We now have people who are in decision-making positions, and as Ernest pointed out, they're not alone because they are bringing a posse with them. And that is so important, because even if you're the alleged boss and you're the only one in the room, you're really not empowered. So I think seeing these people rise up but also have the support that they need to succeed, that's really the game changer.
So the awards shows, if we kind of shift gears a little bit, they were kind of messed up this spring as producers tried to adjust to COVID protocols. You might remember that when Tina Fey and Amy Poehler hosted the Golden Globes, each of them on a different coast, that they explained the award show and how it normally goes down to an audience of the first responders, there as special guests, in this way.
Since you guys aren't usually here, let us explain what this even is. The Golden Globes are awards given out by the Hollywood Foreign Press Association.
The Hollywood Foreign Press Association is made up of around 90 international no-black journalists who attend movie junkets each year in search of a better life. We say around 90 because a couple of them might be ghosts, and it's rumored that the German member is just a sausage that somebody drew a little face on.
So Monday, NBC announced that it won't be airing the Golden Globes next year because of all of the controversies that are surrounding the Hollywood Foreign Press Association. Their monologue didn't tiptoe around it this year. There's a lack of diversity among the voting members. There has been a real reluctance to accept any of the demands from the Time's Up movement. What kind of statement is NBC making in joining the streaming services, Ernest, that you were talking about them seeing as the competition, joining Netflix and Amazon and Warner Brothers in kind of joining this boycott against the Golden Globes and the Foreign Press Association?
Well, I mean, you're right. They're joining the protests, and they're joining the protests a little late in the game. I mean, it wasn't until the streaming services basically said, we're out. And then NBC went, well, if they're out, then there's really no show. Because as we've talked about before, the streaming services have basically taken over in terms of entertainment, movies, that sort of thing, distribution. And if they're saying we're exiting stage left, we don't want to have anything to do with this craziness, then NBC has had no choice but to do what it did. And that is going to be the thing that, well, at least they're hoping to either do one or two things: force them to actually make some substantive changes and make them fast, or dissolve. Those are the only two choices that they have right now at this point.
So, Kathy, you asked me to add an additional link to our links blog, something that went back a little bit. I don't know. I think it was back into right after that telecast. You have a little bit of a different theory here as to why NBC might have been so quick, well, not so quick, but jumped onto this.
Yeah, well, call me a cynic, but I think this is a virtue signaling that's wrapped around a financial decision. The link we posted is about the ratings for the last show that just absolutely tanked. And I think if you look, a lot of these award shows are having difficulty maintaining audience. I mean, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, what you brought up. How do you compete in a world of non-appointment TV, streaming, video, zillions of choices? And, you know, I think these award shows, it kind of reminds me of when I was working in D.C. It used to be a big deal to go to the National Press Club to hear somebody speak. Or it used to be a big deal to go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner because you might see some important person in an off-the-cuff moment. Well, you can just go onto YouTube and see that anytime now. So I think the cachet is gone, and I think the award shows are suffering from that. And so I think NBC saw an opportunity to get out of a lousy contract, or to dump out of something that they might have wanted to dump out of anyway, and look like they're being virtuous at the same time. I
mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the award itself has become more important than the award show. Because you're not sure. I mean, if you're a star, you can basically say, yeah, I'm going to skip it. You still get the award and you still get the notoriety, but you don't have to sit with a whole bunch of other people for 4 hours listening to people give bad jokes and make bad speeches. I mean, it's just, I think the award shows have pretty much played themselves out. I mean, the Oscars may go on for another, decade or so, but even at some point, that's gonna morph into something else.
One of the things about these award shows, at least the one and only attraction I would have, would be the red carpet. See what everybody wore, and that was the end of it for me. And when you're talking about doing these virtually because of COVID, there is no red carpet. I don't need to see Regina King sitting on her couch. Like, there went that whole thing. If I've seen the movie, great. The Golden Globes, in some ways, kind of served as that Kentucky Derby to the Preakness. Like, what could possibly happen for the Oscars, right? That preview of kind of
the
weeding
Woodlawn
out the
for the
contenders.
Derby. I'm just going to give you. I'm just going to give because you're
enough.
obviously not a sports person.
Okay. Well, enough of one. I'm just thinking about them coming in chronology, if you will. Like, by the time you get to the Belmont, if you've had the person who's won the Derby and then won the Preakness, and if we're looking for the Triple Crown, you work it up to the Oscars.
Yeah, I'm with you.
All right.
Okay, now you're following now?
Gotcha.
How did we get on that?
We only tease people we like. Yeah, right.
But where I was going to go with it ultimately is if the Globes end up kind of losing this cachet, if you say that like this could be the end of them, does this potentially elevate the Screen Actors Guild Awards or the Critics' Choice? Are we just over it?
I don't think it elevates any of them. I think we're over it. I mean, here's the thing. People will watch the music awards to hear the music and the stars and to see what they're going to do on the music
I stopped watching the music
award.
awards because I stopped listening to that music 20 years ago.
Well, that's true, but there's another generation that'll watch it.
Yeah.
The Oscars and though they don't have that cachet, they don't have those musical acts coming in to be able to keep the show going the way the music ones do. And I think that's one of the differences there.
You raise another interesting point that I'm just going to throw out there as a casual movie goer type person. I look at the differences in what were at one point box office hits, and what would be considered contenders. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, because I may know as much about movies as I do horse racing. But really, what's showing up in theaters is not what, with the exception of Black Panther, you're not seeing those blockbuster hits of the Star Wars movies or the Marvel comic movies. Like, those aren't necessarily the award contenders to continue to fuel those awards.
It's been a long time since that actual award contender was the most popular or the most money-making movie out there.
That's kind of my point.
Right,
like what
right.
people are actually watching or interested in being a part of.
Right. And the other part you have there is the streaming services.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that the pandemic brought about was, hey, I can actually watch this at home whenever I want to and not have to do all these other. I mean, there is an experience to go into the movie theaters, which I really do miss. Mm-hmm. But I think the streaming services have brought something to audiences that convenience part that is going to be tough for movie studios. I mean, the studios.
Well, and I
themselves,
think the biggest plus of the streaming services is it makes a lot more movies a lot more accessible.
Yep.
So you don't have to live in a major metropolitan area to get even some of the niche movies that you might not see. You felt like, well, you had to go to some New York City art house to see certain movies. So I think that's one of the big pluses of the streaming services.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's change topics again. There is an expectation that on Monday, the University of Missouri and MU Healthcare will resume normal on-campus operations. And that now that the vaccine has become largely available to the general public long enough to have had 2 jabs and 2 weeks since, that it's safe to return. The School of Journalism's newsroom operations are slowly returning to more in-person staffing as well, just like a lot of newsrooms are across the country. And that's creating some management challenges as people are trying to figure out how to bring people back into their newsrooms in a way that not just is safe, but feels safe to employees as well. So imagine how people at the Washingtonian
magazine.
You.
Yes.
That word just wasn't coming out today. How they felt when they saw an opinion piece penned by their CEO that said she thought that the way to motivate people to come back to the office is to change a remote worker's status from full-time employee to contractor. Kathy, they took that as a public threat to their jobs and their livelihoods.
Yeah, as somebody said, if you're going to break a labor law, you shouldn't do it in a public op-ed.
That's right.
That's pretty threatening, pretty heavy-handed. But I think the larger point, and there's obviously blowback. I think the Washington Post changed the headline on that piece at one point, and I think they were trying to help the writer out, the boss of the Washingtonian. She's walked it back. But I think the larger point that this highlights is, a lot of people haven't really been out of their houses for a year or more. And so there's naturally going to be a little bit of agoraphobia here. Plus, there's a general, I think, a real health care, people are just trying to feel their way here. So I think steady as she goes, and I think a lot of the major media outlets are slowly coming back. I mean, it's not all at once. And I think that's probably a smart move because we work in very close quarters. We are literally in each other's faces in a newsroom. And it's been really weird for me not being able to edit in the usual way. So I can only imagine in a newsroom with tons of deadlines and lots of people. It's a real challenge. And I think,
there's hesitancy. There's hesitancy across the board when you start talking about employees coming back into their spaces, and you're having employees that are starting to push back into coming into these environments. But as a friend of mine pointed out, because we were having a conversation this weekend, well, you have to be careful if you're an employee, because if you're able to do your job at home and you're doing it efficiently, what's to keep an employer, be it a governmental or private, to say, well, I might be able to outsource that job and not have to pay benefits and not have to pay overhead. So you're pushing.
And I think that was kind of her point, if she made it in a very clumsy way.
Right, absolutely. I mean, in your push not to come in, you're giving me a reason to outsource your job. So you have to. There's a fine line that a lot of people are walking right now as we move into the post-pandemic era.
Okay, so you might have also heard that Facebook, the corporation, is working to start a new Instagram for kids. It'll be a platform that's meant to be safer for kids who want to be on social media but don't meet the 13-year-old age requirement to join. Instead of lying about their ages, as some are apt to do, the company wants to meet that demand by starting a separate site that it says will have safeguards in place. It's worth noting that 44 state attorneys general have filed statements in opposition to that move. Meanwhile, on Facebook, the platform, the company is toying with a new feature that on the surface of things sounds like it's well-intentioned. The idea is to curb massive efforts to misinform by asking people if they still want to share a link that they haven't yet clicked through to read. Now, Ernest, I want to tap into your skepticism on this one. Any chance this actually works?
No, there's no chance this is going to work. Because, it's sort of a thing, policy and process does not stop bad actors, okay? So if somebody really wants to do it, they're just going to continue to, it's like, they're not even going to pay any attention to that. They're just going to click it, send it on.
And who's going to be shamed by Facebook into actually clicking through to read the article if they haven't already read it? If they think it's important enough to share, they're probably already in that information bubble.
Right. Be it good information or bad information.
Right. Well, I think, it is a well-intentioned move. One of the things that media literacy folk talk about all the time is the need to think before you automatically share something. So maybe it will put the brakes on a few people.
Yeah, even you sound skeptical.
Yeah, I am. Yes, I think it's very. When I talk about news literacy, I like to throw up the cartoon from Walt Kelly that Pogo is looking in the mirror and we have met the enemy and he is us.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, I don't know that there's much that Facebook can do about that. And on Kitty Instagram, how many preteens do you know are going to say, oh, yeah, I'll take the safe route?
Right.
Yeah. I don't want that adult one.
No. Instead, they're just going to lie about their age.
Yeah.
Well, we are pretty much out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending your last half hour with us. You can read more about each of the topics we talked about today on our links blog. That's under both the programs and podcast tabs at kbia.org. We're also wherever you get your podcast downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. There we are at Views on KBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again. Leave us comments, questions, see what we'll be talking about next time, too. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show and Aaron Hay for handling the audio. Tim Pilcher composed our original theme music. We're taking a couple weeks off, but we will see you again back in June. Take care.